Tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN's Q&A. Several scholars discuss their research exploring the history of Muslims in New York City, the diversity within the community, and Muslim contributions to American society. The Brooklyn Historical Society's Muslims in Brooklyn Project and the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding's Muslims for American Progress initiative co-host the event.
Good evening. Welcome. Thank you all for coming out in this nasty weather. We're really happy to see you here. For those of you who are sitting in back, if you feel like it, we'd love to have you come up front a little bit more. We always have a good and lively conversation with the audience, and it's great to see people come up front if you feel like it. My name is Deborah Schwartz. I'm the president of the Brooklyn Historical Society, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all tonight. I just want to get a sense of how many of you are here for the first time. Nice. Great. Wonderful. Welcome to those of you who know us well, and welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. We hope you'll make this a place you come back to often. This program tonight, Muslims in New York City, Lessons from the Past, Visions for the Future, is part of a tremendously important initiative here at the Brooklyn Historical Society, a project we call Muslims in Brooklyn, which is a very multifaceted project that's really been very important to us for the last several years. It's a project that involves oral histories, it involves educational programs. We will have an exhibition in the fall, in September, that we hope you'll come back to. We're working on an educational curriculum. There are many, many community conversations that are part of this project. There will be a website that's part of the project. And what we are so thrilled with by the work we're doing here is the fact that the history of Muslims in Brooklyn has really not been something that has been systematically studied, researched, and told until our very brilliant oral historian, Zaheer Ali, arrived on the scene and made this commitment to spearhead and direct this project. And he has done so with such incredible focus and enthusiasm and intelligence that we have been very, very privileged. And now we have moved from an organization that had basically almost no stories, no collections, no evidence of the Muslim communities in Brooklyn, to an organization that has a very deep and real commitment and connection to those communities. And so it is, from my perspective, very powerful and meaningful to be here with all of you tonight to have this important conversation. So this evening's program, like many of our programs here, is not one that we do in isolation, and we're very pleased to be doing this presentation tonight in partnership with the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding's Muslims for American Progress New York City project. We're grateful for their collaboration, and I know you're going to hear more about that in a few minutes. So with that, I just wanted to introduce Zaheer, who will then take on the rest of the introductions for the evening. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about Zaheer, who is, as I said, our oral historian and the project director of Muslims in Brooklyn. And he is also the co-producer of our podcast, Flatbush and Maine, which is an award-winning podcast. It comes out on a regular monthly schedule, and it is now in its 4th year of production, which is quite wonderful, and I urge you to check it out. For those of you who love podcasts, it's really incredibly interesting and covers a myriad of subjects. and really is an exploration of everything from our oral history collections to our archival collections and our colleagues and scholars from all over the city and beyond. In addition to Flatbush in Maine, Zaheer is also an adjunct lecturer at New York University, where he has taught courses on U.S. history, on Malcolm X, and on Prince Rogers Nelson. He served as the project manager of the Malcolm X Project at Columbia University, where he worked as the lead researcher for Manning Marabel's Pulitzer Prize-winning Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. With that, it is my great honor to introduce my colleague, Zaheer Ali.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you all for joining us. I'm going to ask my co-panelists to join me on stage. We're going to do this conference style, so no surprise reveals here. As Deborah explained, this program is being offered as part of the Muslims in Brooklyn project, which I'm really proud and honored to direct here at Brooklyn Historical Society. This program is one in a series of programs that we have had since we publicly launched the project in December at the completion of our oral history component. We've had a series of listening parties throughout Brooklyn, throughout different neighborhoods in Brooklyn. We have one Wednesday coming up in City Line. We have one next week on the 20th in Kensington. And we have a series of programs lined up, at least one program every month for the rest of the year. So that gives you a sense of the commitment of this institution to this project and the amount of material that we look forward to going through. And so I'm happy to talk more about that as the evening progresses. There are three main ideas we wanted to foreground in doing this project. Very basic ideas, and I think many of our presentations will kind of speak to that. One is that Muslims have a long history in the United States, in New York City, and in Brooklyn. That isn't to say that a long history is a prerequisite for citizenship. You can be a newly arrived person and still be entitled to human dignity and rights. But it is important for us to acknowledge that Muslims have a long history. The second main idea is that Muslims are a diverse group of people. It is impossible to profile Muslim communities by any one single ethnicity, nationality, tradition, level of observance, that there is an intersection of identities that comprise Muslim communities. And then finally, that Muslims are integral, have been integral to shaping, for us, Brooklyn, but certainly New York City and the United States. And so our conversation today is going to help give a little bit of context for these ideas. First, we will have Sylvia Chan-Malik give us a kind of broad overview of the history of Muslims in the United States. Then Elisabeth Becker will give us a more focused look at Muslims in New York City, and then I will bring up the tail end with Muslims in Brooklyn. So first, let me introduce. I'm going to do the introductions for both of you, so that way I can sit down and then we can just come up. So first, we're going to hear from Sylvia Chan-Malik, who's an associate professor in the departments of American and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where she directs the social justice program and teaches courses on race and ethnicity in the United States. Islam in and America, social justice movements, feminist methodologies, and multi-ethnic literature and culture in the U.S. She is the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam, published last year, and there are copies of the book out in our bookshop if you'd like to get one. And I'm going to volunteer. You might stay back to sign if anyone buys them. She speaks frequently on issues of U.S. Muslim politics and culture, Islam and gender, racial and gender politics in the U.S., and her commentary has appeared in venues such as NPR, Slate News, The Intercept, Daily Beast, Huffington Post, Pathos, Religion News Service, and others. She holds a PhD in Ethnic Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MFA in Creative Writing from Mills College. She's also one of our advisors on the Muslims in Brooklyn project, so we just like pull people and get them to work. Then we'll hear from Elisabeth Becker, who is a PhD in sociology from Yale University, and where she was a fellow in cultural sociology and religion and politics. She graduated with a BA in sociology from Cornell University and a Master's of Science in Refugee Migration Studies from Oxford University, and an MPhil, she got the MPhil because she got the PhD. It's like, you know, all these letters get confusing after a while. The PhD is the end of the story. Her interests center on religion, ethnicity, culture, and inequality. Her dissertation drew from over 2 years of ethnographic research in European mosques, where she examined the contestation over Islam and its connections to national identity struggles in Germany, Great Britain, and Spain. She is the principal investigator on the MAP NYC project, the Muslims for American Progress project, which utilizes both quantitative and qualitative methods to understand Muslim contributions to New York City. So with that, I'm going to hand over the podium to Sylvia, who is going to take us on our historical journey.
Thank you. You know, I deserve that applause because I have been tasked with reviewing and offering you 500 years of history in 15 minutes. So yeah, here we go. Oh, I don't have slides. I'm fine. I don't have, I wish I did. I'll try to be very descriptive. But thank you so much for being here tonight for this wonderful program and this wonderful work that Zaheer is doing here at the Brooklyn Historical Society and that Elisabeth is doing at ISPU. It's so important because we live in a moment in which it seems like almost every conversation that we have in politics and culture, when you turn on the news, that 24-hour news cycle, whether we're aware of it or not, somewhere in that conversation, you will find Islam and Muslims as either in a very obvious or maybe not so obvious pretext or subtext to that conversation. So, you know, for example, I always pull this one up. You're talking about the US-Mexico border wall like we were back in January, you know, another one of these debates around whether to build the wall, and all of a sudden the conversation is about prayer rugs in the desert, right? I don't know if you remember that news story about how they said they were finding prayer rugs in the desert, and this seems to happen a lot. You know, all these conversations around fresh people in the House of Representatives, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. You know, there's all this talk all the time, and there's so little of substance in these conversations. So thank you to Zaheer and to Elisabeth for the really important work they do. So I just want to give you an overview of these 4 main periods that I understand Islam's presence and the presence of Muslims in the U.S. as fitting within, kind of very broadly. And of course, they're not discrete, they're not bounded, there's spaces in between these categories. But the 4 periods that I want to talk about, first of all, is the period, the colonial period from the early from the 1500s into the 1800s. Okay, so this is the first period in which Islam and Muslims start to be a real presence in the United States. Then I want to move on to the next period very briefly, which is the early 20th century, following the Great Migration North of African Americans after the Reconstruction period, right? And then the next period in which Islam and Muslims become significant in a U.S. context is in the post-1965 era, after the passage of a very significant immigration bill, which I will tell you about in a minute. And finally, we find ourselves in the place that we are now, which I just kind of generally call the post-9/11 period. And, you know, now we're in the Trump era, in which some of the post-9/11 manifestations have evolved into new and, oftentimes surreal kind of manifestations. So the first period in which Islam and Muslims become to be really significant in the US context are in the earliest days of chattel slavery. Now, as many of you have probably seen in different types of news articles and things, and as Zaheer has just said, Muslims have been present in the US for centuries. Right? Even before Columbus arrived on these shores, there were Muslims who were on ships that were coming for trade, right? And coming and exploring and creating narratives around their presence in the Americas, not just the US, but in the Caribbean and South America as well. But the first large-scale presence was amongst those enslaved Africans who were forcibly brought to the US during chattel slavery. And historians estimate that anywhere, and this is a very hard number to kind of pin down, anywhere between 10% to 30% of enslaved Africans that were brought to the US were from a region of West Africa, which is now Senegal and the Gambia, right, which is predominantly Muslim. Right? So one can then surmise that anywhere between 10 to 30% of enslaved Africans were Muslim. Now, amongst this population, the lives that we have documented are those of very highly literate, oftentimes those of noble lineage. A well-known Muslim who was enslaved during that time is a man named Abdul Rahman, and there was a documentary that was made about him called The Prince of Slaves. And he was a nobleman, which his masters were very surprised to find that he was completely fluent in Arabic and literate, and he had this very noble bearing. And when this was discovered, his masters kind of worked to free him. He wound up traveling to Europe and living out the rest of his life there. But those stories, while they are fascinating, and there are actually a number of them, right, they're few and far between. Of that 30% of enslaved peoples, many were not noblemen. Many were, workers or people who had come in whatever trades they were in, right? And while they were not able to practice their religion or build their institutions in the ways that other arrivals to our shores might have, they left an impression on this country, and they created a presence of Islam in this country that lives on in very different ways, right? So for example, if any of you are fans of the blues, ethnomusicologists have traced a direct lineage between the call to prayer and the different types of music in West Africa that was made around the call to prayer, the azan, right? And blues music, field songs, right? Field hollers of early enslaved peoples. And you can hear that continuity. It's absolutely amazing. In the food, in the cuisine, you can also see those continuities as well. And so while the formal practice of Islam was largely not too apparent, right, by the end of the 19th century, these ways in which Islam persisted in culture, in food, in people's memories, in their legacies lived on. Islam re-emerged once again in an African-American context in the early 20th century in this country, following the end of the Civil War, the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, and the Reconstruction period, during the Great Migration north of African-Americans from the South to places like Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York. Right? So en masse, African Americans came to these urban centers to find new work, to find new jobs, opportunities. And in these new places, a lot of them rejected Christianity because they saw Christianity as the religion of slave owners and slave masters, and one that had been used to justify their dehumanization. And so in these new spaces, in these spaces where they could reinvent themselves, they sought out new religions as well. And in this place, we see the emergence of Islamic organizations like the Moorish Science Temple, the Ahmadiyya movement in Islam. If anybody here is a jazz fan, there was a movement called the Ahmadiyya movement, which was a South Asia-based missionary movement through which jazz musicians like Ahmad Jamal, Yusuf Lateef, McCoy Tyner all converted to Islam and practiced throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Right? And finally, most famously, probably the group that most people are familiar with is the Nation of Islam. So, as you can tell from this story, the vast majority, and let me make sure I'm doing well on time here, the vast majority of Muslims in this country prior to around 1960 or 70 were African American. So if you were to meet a Muslim kind of walking down the street or encounter anyone who called themselves a Muslim or find any press about Muslims in the US, they were talking about African American Muslims, black Muslims, who saw Islam as an alternative to Christianity and also as a critique of Christianity and white supremacy. And this is a very strong legacy of Islam's presence in the United States, that it is this anti-racist, liberation-oriented theology that African Americans took up to find and embody and live their full humanity within a global community in a way that transcended domestic boundaries of race and class and gender. Right? And we'll talk about the gender piece more later. Following that, the next kind of period, in 1965, we saw the passage into this country in the context of the civil rights struggles of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which lifted quotas that had been placed on immigration prior to that time throughout the 20th century. And because of the lifting of the quotas on immigration, we had large numbers, mostly professional class, migrants coming from places like South Asia, the Middle East, what we call the Middle East, and North Africa. And this fundamentally changed the demographic of Muslims in the United States, whereas prior to the 1970s, the vast majority were African American. After the 1965 Immigration Act, you started to see a large number of professional class South Asians, Arab Americans, North Africans coming into the US and changing a lot of the communities and culture that had been established by black Muslims in this country. Right? So the final period, and I'll wrap up here and turn it over to Elisabeth, is what I very broadly call the post-9/11 era. And a story I use to illustrate the post-9/11 era and what happens to Muslims in the post-9/11 period is I'm from Oakland, California. Has anyone been to Oakland, California? Okay, so in Oakland, California, within a 5-mile radius, you have 4 different mosques, right? And so on September 10th, 2001, there were 5 different mosques, or 4 different mosques. There's a Sunni Arab, majority Sunni Arab mosque that's on one block on 31st Street, right? Right around the corner, there's a predominantly South Asian Ahmadiyya Muslim mosque, right around the corner. About 2 miles down the road, you have a predominantly African American Sunni mosque, right? And then about 3 miles down the highway, you have a predominantly South Asian Sunni mosque. Oh, I forgot the 5th one, right by the lake, the Islamic Center of Northern California, and you have a Shia mosque. So there's 5 mosques, and you get there driving within 15 minutes, right? But prior to 9/11, right, if you were to ask anyone at any of those mosques if they knew what was going on at the mosque just 2 miles down the road, they wouldn't know, because there was very little conversation between all of these different groups, right? Because there was no kind of desire or need for these different Muslims to be speaking to each other. And what 9/11 did, I always kind of say, the mechanisms that have kind of went into high gear into place in 9/11 were already present, kind of the methods of surveillance and things like that on Muslim communities. But what happened was it produced the need for Muslims in these different spaces that they had been sequestered in prior to then to talk and figure out what it meant collectively to be Muslims in the United States. Right, and what it meant to kind of forge connections and build coalitions between them in light of the larger political context. So I think since that time, Muslims in the US have been struggling to do so because of the community's incredible diversity, because of the incredible heterogeneity of this group. So many different languages spoken, so many different nations and ethnicities and cultures, right? So many generational differences represented, right? But the history of Islam in the US is rooted in black communities and culture, yet it is extremely diverse, and trying to find a way between its presence as an anti-racist liberation theology of black Americans and this incredibly transnational diasporic expression of a global faith with 1.8 billion practitioners. And that is where we are now, and I think all of that is beautifully represented in New York City and in Brooklyn as well. So I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, so thanks again for joining us tonight, and of course thank you to Zaheer and the Brooklyn Historical Society, as well as Sylvia, for joining me in this presentation. I am going to talk to you a little bit about some positive stories tonight, which is rare in the research I do. And so I've actually really welcomed this opportunity to work with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding on the MAP NYC project, which is essentially a project looks at Muslim contributions to New York City. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the project in an overview, but what I really want to focus on today are 3 instances of kind of overlooked or forgotten or unknown histories and stories of Muslims in New York City. And I'll integrate some of the interviews that we did with 3 places in New York. And since Zaheer is going to talk about Brooklyn, I'm focusing on Manhattan. We spanned the 5 boroughs, so I don't want to, be too Manhattan-centric in this, but my 3 stories will come from Manhattan. So the aim of our project, the MAP NYC project, was first and foremost to fill gaps in knowledge. As everyone here, I'm sure, already knows and will be mentioned throughout this evening, when Muslims are spoken about in American society, in the media, in politics, it's overwhelmingly negative coverage. It's not really representing reality at all. So the goal of this project was essentially to look at New York City. Previously, ISPU had carried out a similar project in Michigan, and the contributions of Muslim Americans in New York City across these 8 categories broadly. So medicine, STEM, civics and democracy, philanthropy and nonprofit, education, economics, arts and entertainment, and sports. And we wanted to combine facts, a lot of statistics, with human faces. And the richest part, I believe, of our project were the interviews and also the photo series that we did. And all photographs tonight that you'll see that are portraits come from our photographer, Syed Yakin, who's actually here in the audience. And that told the human stories behind a lot of these facts. So with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, I'll tell you what we are. So ISPU is a think tank. It essentially conducts objective solution-seeking research that empowers American Muslims to develop their community and fully contribute to democracy and pluralism in the United States. In this way, we conduct research. We're not an advocacy organization, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, focusing on the contributions of Muslims to New York City and to the United States in general, we seek to provide information that can be used by policy institutes in social and public policy, as well as the media, to have accurate data. So we talked a little bit about who American Muslims are. Who are Muslim New Yorkers? You would think, given the media coverage, that actually this is a huge percentage of the United States, but as Sylvia already mentioned, it's really just 1% of the population. That's huge and tiny at the same time. Contextually, it's not a really big percentage of the US, but the US is a large country, and so it's a lot of people. In New York City, however, it's almost 9% of the population. You're looking at almost or over 22% of America's Muslims living in New York City alone. So it's quite a large percentage of the population in the 5 boroughs, and concentrated, of course, in certain areas. There is very little demographic data on Muslims, as everyone here will have learned. So I can explain, if there are stats people in here who want to talk more about data, how we got these numbers. It is a rough estimate, but it's kind of the closest we've come, and it aligns with Pew and other major research institutes in their estimates. So according to us, in 2017, there were 768,767 Muslims. But today, again, I'm going to focus on the silences and empty spaces, on the history and stories of Muslims in New York City. Although we know that Muslims arrived in New York City during the 1600s or so as slaves, as Sylvia spoke about, and that mosques that are here to this day were registered at about the turn of the 20th century, so in 1907. So the 3 places in New York that I want to direct you towards are a street corner in Harlem, a tenement on Orchard Street, and a food cart on 53rd and 6th Avenue. So since like, what do you think about? This is something I was thinking when I wanted to plan this presentation. When you think of New York City and what New York City is, it's a lot. But it's a center of civics and activism. It's a place that people associate with diversity and immigration, creativity, finance, and for me, probably most importantly, food. So there is nowhere like New York in the US. In the minutes that I have, I will introduce you to these 3 places. One is a story about food, but the first is 127th Street. This is going to touch on contributions of Black Muslim communities, which are very diverse. This includes the Nation of Islam, but not only the Nation of Islam, in Harlem. So I'm going to introduce you to this through a personal story of Hisham Tawfiq. You might have seen him on a lot of shows. He's been on 30 Rock. He's currently on a show called The Blacklist. And in this image, what you see is the site where the mosque was, where he grew up, and he speaks a bit about this mosque in our interview. So Hisham Tawfiq, again, is an actor who was born, raised, and is still based in Harlem. Although he's been on shows like 30 Rock and Law & Order and Nurse Jackie, he also worked as a correctional officer in the Marines and as a firefighter. So he's spoken a lot about growing up in Harlem and the influences on his life. And one of the most moving pieces I found was when he spoke about this corner where the mosque was being painted yellow. And the reason it was painted yellow, he told us, was because it became a protective space in the neighborhood. When he grew up in Harlem, so this is in the 1970s, there were a lot of drugs in the area that he grew up in. And so kids and teenagers could go there from all different backgrounds and basically hang out on that corner and feel protected. And he said there were these moments where you'd see like people fighting or someone was getting chased, and as soon as the kid or the teenager mostly would step onto that corner, the person would stop. So it was this respected boundary in the community. He explained his motivation for his most recent project, which is actually a documentary on his really interesting and diverse life. And he spoke about how in the Marines and in firefighting and in his work as an actor, all of the same kind of issues had come up, especially after 9/11. And so, in his words, there has become more of the need to speak on my experience and talk about the contributions that Muslims, and specifically African American Muslims, made to New York City and all cities across the country, end quote. So if you actually want to learn more about Muslim life in Harlem and the history, there is this PhD student who flies from North Carolina intermittently to give tours. She was in the New Yorker recently, and she introduces you to everything, to Malcolm X's former mosque on 127th, to bookstores where he used to read, and the musical history of African American Muslims, which is really deep. Sylvia, again, spoke about this, but yeah, we haven't talked, or we don't hear much about that in the media, but a lot of, hip hop as well as the blues and jazz influenced deeply by Muslim Americans. So the second place, which many of you probably know by now, is on 53rd and 6th. It's still there, but now this is a sort of chain throughout the country, and that's the Halal Guys. Now, the reason I want to talk about the Halal Guys is because food carts are this kind of epitome of New York City. I think that you can't imagine the story and the history of New York without food, and the diversity of New York and its kind of culture of immigration and also fusion is represented in the food culture. So it's actually, I've traveled a lot across the world, and I would say it's one of the only places in the world where you can literally taste the world. And fine dining, of course, is this aspect of the food culture here, but a bigger part, and I think a more democratic piece of the food culture, are food carts. Food carts historically were run by Jewish and Greek immigrants, but today over 57% of New York City food vendors are Muslim. And the Halal Guys is just this evidence of one Muslim food cart that sort of rose to become this national chain, but it's also interconnected with a, sadly, I don't want to say dying, but kind of falling part of the New York industry that we think about and we picture when we think of New York, and that's taxi drivers. So the reason that the halal food carts arose actually was to serve the taxi drivers, because over 40% of New York City's taxi drivers are Muslims. And they needed kind of like quick, delicious, filling food on the go. But I also wanted to point out that something that has changed in recent years, because I left New York, I grew up here, but in the last few years I haven't been living here, And I've noticed when I come back is that people now talk about halal. So in the way you used to talk about getting a hot dog or something else on the street, knish, when I was a teenager, you now talk about grabbing halal. And so it is sort of integrated into everyday vocabularies. My last story is the story of the tenements. When we think of the tenements, and I'm pointing out a building where one of the women we interviewed lived and grew up, 140 Orchard Street. When we think of the tenements, we often think about Jewish, Irish, Italian life in the city. We think of the Lower East Side as this kind of rich immigration culture, but we don't usually think about Muslim influence on the Lower East Side. So this photograph that you see here is of Abida Kanam. She moved to the tenements when she was a teenager to live with her father, who is a local community leader and imam. And she really speaks beautifully about her experience. Today, she's become this very kind of important educator in New York City. She's known everywhere. She also really spearheads mental health in the Muslim community and beyond. And I want to show you a short video because she actually talks about her experience much more eloquently than I will. But it really points to kind of this left out history and story. And this continues to this day, that there is a significant Muslim populace in the tenements. There still are tenements, which I only recently learned, that have not been renovated. But this is one of these kind of silent pieces. And so I think he'll put on the video. It's 3 minutes.
I'm a teenager, entering the city for the first time. We cross the bridge in a yellow cab, pull up to the building in the Lower East Side that's now our home. And I think, this is America? I ask Dad to use the bathroom. He hands me a key and points me to the hallway outside the apartment. I find myself without a mother, with a bathtub in the middle of the kitchen. I realize this new life will require some adjusting to. Years go by. Our living room is also me and my brother's bedroom, and a space for my father's meetings. He's a community leader. People come to him to translate their marriage certificates, explain their immigration status, and mediate disputes. I'm the scribe taking notes on my typewriter, learning different languages, and making tea for everyone. Fast forward, I'm on a plane again, this time back to Bangladesh to get married. Dad says, I want you to marry an imam. Knowing the stereotypes, I refuse. My father says, Amar to shomoy beshi nai, tumi amar ekmatra furi, amar lakhan ekjon dindar manushorat to tumare diya jaitam. I'm happy when I meet my husband, who is far from the stereotypes. Back in New York, I'm hired by a neighborhood school, impressed by the various languages I speak, and in need of someone who can relate to the community. I soon realize I want to have students of my own, and I become a teacher. My students come from 30 different countries. Many don't have enough to eat sometimes. They need more than just the biology lessons from the textbooks. When the principal asks why I'm cooking chicken curry, pancakes, and gulab jamun on the hot plate in science lab, I explain the relevance down to diffusion and cellular respiration. Now the days of typing notes on Orchard Street are long gone. Families come to me about the problems they're facing and for help with their children. Sometimes I run into elders in the community who knew my father. Their greeting is almost always some variation of, "Ah, you are Maulana's daughter." It makes perfect sense.
So I mean, it speaks for itself really, but I think Abida spoke a lot about how growing up in the tenements and her father's role as a community leader, not just for the local Muslim community, but the community as a whole, influenced her life. They spoke 5 languages. One of them was Spanish, because there was also a large Latino community in the neighborhood, and her father would help them with their issues, including immigration status issues. And so it's very, I think, a very New York story about people living close together, but also revealing a silence. So to conclude, I just want to leave you with thinking about New York's history, both deep and contemporary, and whose stories we're telling. All of these narratives point to different types of silences. When we think of Harlem, we often do think of African American history, but not necessarily Muslim history. And when we think of the food culture of New York, we do think about diversity and immigration, and halal has become kind of a point of language, but we don't really know the richness of the food culture. And of course, the tenements are very specific, but they're also this epitome of the immigration story of New York and its long history. And until recently, I, for one, at least knew nothing about the Muslim history in the tenements. So I'll conclude with a quote that I love, which is from J.M. Coetzee, and the quote is, "In every story there is a silence, some concealed, some word unspoken. Till we have spoken the unspoken, we have not come to the heart of the story." Thank you.
Thank you both, Elisabeth and Sylvia. I'm going to set the timer up because we have been really good with our time, so I want to continue that tradition. So the Muslims in Brooklyn project, you've heard a little bit about it, and I'm going to talk about how we've been approaching the histories of Muslims in Brooklyn. First, we have kind of thought about the histories of Muslims in Brooklyn with these 5 themes. One, the theme of migrations, both physical migration, but also spiritual migration. Migration of people to the United States, migration of people to Brooklyn from other parts of the United States, migration of people out of Brooklyn. As we know, there is a serious concern with gentrification and displacement that has caused a lot of people to leave Brooklyn. The spiritual migrations is a story of people who come to Islam as well as the people who leave Islam, so that we are not essentializing the stories of Muslims to any one population. The second theme is the theme of institution building, which is something that usually happens almost as soon as people get rooted in a neighborhood. The need to establish schools or educational centers, places of worship, bookstores to sell religious paraphernalia, food shops that sell food that is consistent both with cultural, culinary style, but as well as what is permissible religiously. And this also is very similar to what you would see in the histories of early Jewish communities in New York City and certainly Brooklyn. The third theme is neighborhood, looking at how neighborhoods have been shaped and how people have been shaped by their neighborhoods. The fourth is civic engagement. And this tends to be historically when communities have reached a kind of maturity in their presence, where you begin to see organizing around political activity, both through the traditional forms of political engagement, like electoral activity, but also to protest. And when you see civic engagement, that is a statement by a community of confidence, and of rootedness. And then the final theme is arts and culture. Certainly, Brooklyn has been a thriving center for music and visual arts, and Muslims have played a significant role in that. We've alluded to some of that, talking about the role of Muslims in music. So I wanted to kind of give you a map of Brooklyn for people who are not so familiar with Brooklyn and these neighborhoods, as well as a kind of rough timeline highlighting some very key points that I'm going to mention. And I will come back to this map, so if you don't get your snap in this moment, that's fine. I think what is important for us is this project has been based on oral histories, and oral histories are incredibly rich and useful, but they are limited. You can usually just go back as maybe if you're lucky, a century. Our oldest narrator in our collection is 74 years old. And so our oral history collection tells the stories of Muslims in the 20th century. And as Sylvia and Elisabeth both mentioned, that history, of course, extends back before the 20th century. But I will say that the way that we've framed our project is to focus on the presence of organized Muslim communities. And so even though we know, for example, if you go to the African burial ground, there are markers for buried enslaved Africans that are Muslim markers, which is a clear evidence that there were enslaved Muslims in New York City. We also know that Brooklyn was one of the largest slaveholding boroughs in New York City because it was for many of its, much of its 17th and 18th and 19th century a farmland. And the people who worked that farmland were enslaved people until the abolition of slavery in the 1820s. And it is not unlikely that some of those people were Muslims. But we don't have a historical record of that. And certainly we don't have, except for maybe in the southeast, Sapelo Island, the islands off the coast of Georgia and the Carolinas, real evidence of organized Muslim communities. And so for us, we've been focusing on that. So we're going to start with the Williamsburg story. One of the earliest communities to establish a Muslim community in Brooklyn was established by Tatars from Eastern Europe, Lithuania, Poland, and they established the American Mohammedan Society in 1907, and they opened a mosque in 1931 at 104 Power Street. It's still there. It is the oldest surviving mosque in New York State. Brooklyn can claim that. And it is one of the oldest surviving mosques in the country. Brooklyn can claim that. And there was a significant activity. One of the earliest reports of Muslim activity in Brooklyn was in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, a newspaper report in 1930 that reported on the Eid celebration, one of the festivals of Muslims. And this took place at the Royal Palace, which was at 18 Manhattan Avenue. It was on the ground floor restaurant, on the second floor meeting space where actually then taxi cab drivers were gathering to deliberate whether or not to go on strike. And on the third floor was a dance hall that had been rented out for the prayer service for Muslims. And the people were described, it was said that the third floor for some 4 hours this morning was turned into a Mohammedan mosque. And in attendance were mostly Hindu Mohammedans. And we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that. That is a clear elision between ethnicity and religion, which we're going to get into in our discussion. But I love that quote. Hindu Mohammedans, Persians, Arabs, Russians. The two leaders of the prayer service were named Hussein Rafikov and S. Ali Shankowitz. So very likely they were members of the American Mohammedan Society, given those names. So this is an important starting point for us, and we were very fortunate that this structure still exists for us to kind of tell that history. Moving into the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and I've highlighted now Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, East New York, and Brooklyn Heights, is when you have the emergence of the earliest African-American Muslim communities. One is located at State Street, here in downtown Brooklyn. It's now called Masjid Dawood. At the time, it was called the Islamic Mission to America, which was founded in the 1930s by an Afro-Caribbean man named Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and his wife Khadija, who opened up their brownstone for prayer services for many of the merchant seamen who were coming docking on the waterfront, looking for a place to pray. And they did this, of course, in an area that was already beginning to grow as a significant Arab community. Atlantic Avenue, Cobble Hill, Court Street was the site of many Arab-owned businesses, mostly Christian early, many coming from what was called Little Syria in downtown Manhattan. But then subsequent waves were Muslim, and so this was a significant institution. And then in the 1960s especially, you have the emergence of the Nation of Islam in Brooklyn. There was the Harlem Mosque, which was called Mosque Number 7, numbered in the order of their establishment. So in the Nation of Islam, the Detroit Mosque, which was the first site, was Mosque Number 1. Chicago was Mosque Number 2. Milwaukee was Number 3. DC was Number 4. 5 was Cleveland. 6 was Baltimore. 7 was New York. And so in addition to having a mosque in Harlem, they had satellite mosques. And 7A was Harlem, 7B was in Queens, 7C was in Brooklyn. And it was opened by Malcolm X in 1963. And at that opening, over 900 people were in attendance, giving you a sense of a magnitude. And so I'm going to play a clip from an oral history interview we did with a man who is a member of that community. The mosque was, evolved into a masjid. A masjid is the Arabic word meaning a place for prayer or a place for prostration. Most people see the masjid as an Arabic word for mosque, but for Mosque Number 7C, it became Masjid Muhammad and then Masjid Khalifa. And so this oral history clip is with Abdul Rashid Abdullah, who at the time of his interview was the head of Islamic studies at the independent school, the Sister Clara Muhammad School at Masjid Khalifa. He joined the Nation of Islam in the 1970s, but tells the story of the establishment of the mosque and the tradition of transforming urban spaces that was true for many of these communities, including State Street.
Masjid Khalifa, when it was purchased by Minister Malcolm, it was a dance hall. Because my father used to party here. When he was like, oh, I know this place. And Masjid Taqwa was a cocktail lounge. It was called Earl's Cocktail Lounge, which I myself knew because that block was in the time of the 60s and 70s, it was heroin central, and in the late 80s and 90s, it was crack central. So that block was always notorious, and that was a cocktail lounge. Yasin Masjid was the one in East New York, was a youth center. Large building, nice building, and they purchased. And Masjid Mu'minun, if I'm not mistaken, was a slaughterhouse. So, and that's somewhat indicative of the history of black masjids, at least in New York. And we're talking particularly in Brooklyn, that it was not uncommon for a house to be a masjid, like in the case of State Street, which was a townhouse or a brownstone. It was a masjid, or to convert a cocktail lounge or a dance hall or a youth center or a slaughterhouse into a masjid.
So let's move on to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Sylvia talked about the Immigration Act, which really transformed the Muslim communities in the United States. I think the first waves of immigrants that came from abroad were primarily middle class or professionals or students, and then the subsequent waves were more working class people. And so I want to play a clip. Well, many of these communities began settling in more southern neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So you have Kensington, which is a significant Bangladeshi community, Midwood and Coney Island, which many people call Little Pakistan, Bay Ridge and Sunset Park, significant Arab community. Atlantic Avenue is been gentrified, but significant Yemeni community has been present there. And so I'm going to play a clip with one of our other narrators, Mohammed Razvi, who was born in 1971 in Pakistan, immigrated in the 1970s, and lived in Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn. And in this clip, he talks about the role of businesses, these small businesses that were established in the community. His father opened one of the first Pakistani businesses in his neighborhood, and he talks about the importance of these businesses.
My dad purchased the first Muslim grocery store for Pakistani right near the mosque that we were visiting on Coney Island Avenue. And it was the mosque and Punjab grocery store, my dad's store. That's all it was in this neighborhood. And so I was a stock boy, cashier, and a butcher in that grocery store. And I still remember I used to, cut the meat. I used to clean up the place, mop the place, But as I'm doing that, I also seen my dad helping people who did not get their paychecks yet. And they were requesting, can I take some food? I haven't received my paycheck yet. And my dad's like, no problem. He started helping others continuously, and I seen that. A person who comes into the store, who's a new immigrant, I'm looking for a job. Is there any job available? Can you help me? My dad used to take their names and number down. And then if someone else who actually had a job to offer, he would connect them. Then people who had issues in the public schools with their children, trying to get them registered for public schools who just came into the country, my dad used to assist them. The ethnic mom and pop stores are the actual first social service agencies for these community members, the new immigrants. Those are the places, these mom and pop businesses are the ones that people turn to first.
And so Mohammed Razvi actually founded an organization called Council of People's Organization in 2001 after 9/11. After 9/11, and I think Sylvia talked about how this really mobilized many of the Muslim communities to respond to the challenges of surveillance, to respond to the challenges of deportation and having to register. In fact, in what was known as Little Pakistan, that Midwood, Coney Island area, over 50 of the 150 stores closed because of the significant FBI presence, both in having people to register, but also intimidating people. And one newspaper article estimated upwards of 20,000 people left the neighborhood, either going back to Pakistan or leaving New York altogether because of the impact of the state and its presence after 9/11. And so this brings us to the story of civic engagement. And it isn't all doom and gloom that Muslims have mobilized. There have been several campaigns, and I've highlighted some of the significant ones. So in 2005, the Brooklyn Borough President hosted the first iftar for Brooklyn, which was significant. In 2015, New York City Public Schools formally recognized the Eid, a holiday, as part of the official school calendar. We just had this last week where the school was closed for Eid, which was a significant recognition for the presence of Muslims in the school system. In 2013, Muslim plaintiffs filed a class action suit against the city of New York for the NYPD's unconstitutional surveillance of Muslim communities. And all of the plaintiffs in that case, it was known collectively as the Raza versus City of New York case, all of the plaintiffs were Brooklyn-based. Again, Brooklyn can claim that. The case was settled through a court settlement that sought to provide more restrictive guidelines for NYPD's surveillance. And then finally, in 2017, as a sign of other kinds of activism, right out here in Brooklyn, in Borough Hall, the over 5,000 Yemeni store owners of the bodega corner stores shut down their stores at noon on February 2nd, 2017, in what was called the bodega strike, in response to the first iteration of the Muslim ban, which targeted, among many nations, the country of Yemen. And so the last clip I'm going to play is with Dr. Debbie Al-Montasser, who is an educator and activist and a Yemeni American who was one of the organizers of the bodega strike. And in this clip, she describes what it was like on that day.
I finally make my way over to Brooklyn Borough Hall at 3 o'clock, and there were literally over 1,000 people there. I was like totally in shock. I was like, the whole entire plaza was filled with men. And I was like, holy moly, where did all these people come from? And as I was like walking to go into Brooklyn Borough Hall, they all assembled themselves and they prayed the late afternoon prayer. There was no tarmac, nothing. They just literally prayed on the pavement. It was so powerful. It's the very first time in the history of the Yemeni American community that they ever became politically involved. The bodega strike, like that it was something that basically charged them to understand, like if they didn't come out that day, if they didn't close their stores that day, and they didn't make that statement, that they would have no worth. And they realized that they were of worth and value to this country, and that they were not going to sit back, and that they were not going to live in the, in the shadows.
So those are just some of the snippets of stories we've been able to recover our histories of Muslims in Brooklyn. And I think this was a perfect clip to end with in saying that Muslims will not be in the shadows. And with that, I'm going to rejoin my panelists, and we're going to have a brief conversation and then open it up for questions and conversation with members of the audience. So thank you. So I'm like switching hats here. I'm going to be a little bit of a moderator. And we are going to be cognizant of time. I think I went a little bit over, so my apologies. I want to start with Elisabeth, and the MAPS project really, even as you listed some of those statistics, like the number of food carts and cab drivers in the population, I think really surprised a lot of people. Tell us why it was so important to engage in a project that highlighted the contributions of Muslims to New York City, and what the challenges are of this contribution approach to Muslim narratives.
Yeah, so I've spoken about this a lot. In our report, we actually talk about how no group, no person should actually have to kind of set out and say, like, this is what I'm contributing to society. You should think that I'm a full member of society. But then looking at the reality today, there are a lot of non-realities or facts, if you want to use the word, being passed around. And what can you come back at all these stereotypes and these assumptions with when there's really little data? That's something that we were struggling with. When actually we were trying to put things together, we couldn't find many sources. We found really good historical work, but we couldn't find many sources to help kind of guide us or that we could build upon. I feel like this is sort of a first intervention, but it's definitely not comprehensive. And so have to keep in mind and take it with a grain of salt and be aware that, you know, having to highlight contributions already points out a significant problem in our society. At the same time, having this information, it is really rich, and it is used, like we've seen it a lot in the media, especially journalists, but as well as politicians and people who work in social and public policy, using this to say not just you're wrong or that's a stereotype, but actually we have the different information built on this research that shows exactly how you're wrong. And we have this information to sort of fill that gap. And so I think that it is a really important step in this direction. But of course, you know, there's so much more that needs to be done.
Sylvia, I guess along that kind of train of thought, and your work has highlighted, specifically your book has highlighted the work and histories of Muslim women. Talk a little bit about why that was an important intervention in the way that people talk about the histories of Muslims in New York City, Brooklyn, or the United States.
So when you did my introduction, the course I teach at Rutgers on the history of Islam and Muslims in the United States is called Islam in and America. So I give some of the history that I went over, as well as the rich, you know, regional and local histories about Islam and Muslims in the United States, how the religion existed in the U.S., how Muslims lived. Another piece of that is Islam and the United States and America. How has Islam been imagined? Right? And without fail, well, not without fail, but almost every talk or conversation that I have around my work will eventually come to this question of, why do the women wear that? Why do they do that? What's really going on? What does the religion really say? And so the issue of gender, right, and the issue of the oppressed poor Muslim women is such a huge piece of this conversation, right? So the issue of gender, anytime we talk about Islam, is right there in the center. And so first and foremost, I feel as if in order to kind of poke at that and deconstruct that, we actually have to talk about the complexity, the nuance, the richness of women's lives. Because stereotypes are just that. They're lazy ways of characterizing enormous groups of people, oftentimes for political ends. So to talk about women's lives, I see in all of their complexity, their messiness, is a kind of firm stance against that type of, you know, boxed in, rigid type of thinking around gender. Secondly, you know, for me, as a mother of 3 daughters and as someone, you know, who has lived as a woman in my life, you know, you see a lot of the ways in which identity gets constructed for young people. And while we know figures like Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, we see these rappers and things like that, my question is, who was teaching the children how to say their prayers? Who was preparing the food Islamically? Who was teaching them how to pray, how to live as Muslims, how to dress, right? And time again, these are the stories you have to go and talk to women about, right? And so these are the stories that I, as a scholar of American studies and women's and gender studies, were fascinated by. Who were the Muslim women who were in, you know, in the background, not on the pulpit, not in the spotlight, doing? And how does this presence live on? And final note, whereas historically, we might be able to name famous Muslim Americans as Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, if you look at the current political landscape and who are the Muslims in this country who are the most prominent and advocating for communities, it is people like House Representative Ilhan Omar, right? Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, and New York's own Linda Sarsour, right? It's women who are in the public eye, and I think their presence very much has to do with both the ways Muslim women have been imagined with these negative stereotypes, and also the ways in which Muslim women have always been kind of the creators and movers within their communities.
So I have one more question for all of us to consider, and then we'll throw it to the audience. And one of the things that has really challenged us in doing this project is calling the project Muslims in Brooklyn. And the reason why that's a challenge is because we, by calling this project Muslims in Brooklyn, are constructing a community that is diverse, and we're calling it Muslims in Brooklyn. But it's Pakistanis, it's Yemenis, it's Bangladeshis, it's African Americans, it's Senegalese, it's Tatar, it's Latino, it's Puerto Rican, it's Haitian. I mean, we have all of this we have people who are Sunni, who are Shia, who are Ahmadi, who are Nation of Islam, who are 5%, who are, who are observant, who are not observant, who are queer identifying, and so we, in a sense, we struggle with, we have to call it something, right? Like, we have to call it something. But what is it, what are we doing when we have a history of Muslims in United States, Brooklyn, New York? What are the challenges of doing that?
I mean, I think we had similar, how do you identify, why are we using this identity? And part of the reason is because of the way that Muslims are portrayed negatively and constantly portrayed as Muslims. Part of it is the way that people identify themselves. So we really went on people's all we took was self-identification. Like, on everything he said would fit if you identified as Muslim. But someone might, say I'm a Muslim American or American Muslim. Someone might not say that. They might say, I'm a Pakistani American, or they might just say I'm American, or I'm just a New Yorker. There could be all sorts of different layered identities. And I sometimes think about kind of the history of Jewish Americans and Jewish New Yorkers, and this way in which there is this religious, ethnic, racialized identity that comes to the fore that's really dynamic and intersectional, and you can't get away from it because of the ways in which it's also very politicized, and that can be negative, but I also think it does create some cohesion. So you do see communities coming together, unfortunately, since 9/11 or in other instances, because they're labeled as such, and thinking through, what do we share and what can we contribute to this conversation? So I think highlighting that, which I know your project has done, is a positive way in which to take it, but it's not without its complexities, because what you're really capturing is probably, thousands of communities. You're not really capturing a community.
Sylvia, when you chose your subjects for inclusion in your history, how did you make the decision of who to include and how to frame them?
Well, for me, the most part, so my book being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam, prior to 1960, right, the archive that I use is primarily of African-American Muslim women, because in the public documents and in popular culture, that's who publicly identified as a Muslim, right? And so this shifts, right? But my argument is, and I think we can find it in New York City and beyond, is that history doesn't go away, right? That's what I always try to remind students and audiences, that just because now we see Muslims in this post-9/11 framework in which it seems like this exotic, foreign, faraway, terroristic religion, it doesn't change the fact that Islam arrived on U.S. shores through the bodies of enslaved Africans, right? That African Americans created the first institutions, large-scale institutions, right? And so to come back to the question about why we say Muslims in Brooklyn without trying to say, hey, look, there's Muslims in Brooklyn, right? I have this, I had this wonderful student. Every semester I teach the autobiography of Malcolm X, and the student was blown away. Like, they had never heard, oh wow, Malcolm X is such a cool guy. Like, why? He's so cool. Why don't we know more about him? We just learned that he's the opposite of Martin Luther King in class all the time. And what he said was and he was a Muslim student. And he said, gosh, if we didn't have to sit and explain that Muslims were human beings and that we had so much to offer before we actually started talking about the ideas that Muslims have, like Malcolm X, think of all the work we could get done, right? Think of all the things we could actually have conversations about that could actually solve problems if we didn't have to convince you what we're not first. So I think, yes, Muslims are in Brooklyn, but Muslims are incredibly diverse and amazing, and I think there's mean Muslims too, whatever.
Right. Or Muslims who haven't contributed.
There's good people,
anything,
they're bad, just like in every community. But the fact that I think it's not about the homogeneity. It's about the fact of starting the conversation and putting it out there so that we can have those productive conversations about how do we deal with poverty in the city? How do we deal with schools? How do we deal with all these things, right? And I think this is connected. These conversations are connected.
Yeah, I think for us it's been really important that this project is Muslims in Brooklyn and not Islam in Brooklyn, making the distinction between a kind of historically evolved tradition, religious tradition that is almost abstract, and the ways that people embody their identities as individuals. And so I think the benefit of oral histories has been to ground this in the human experiences of each individual, and to say that these oral histories, we have 50 of them, are not representative but indicative. They are indicative of the diversity, they're indicative of the experiences, but they are not fully representative, because there's no way to collapse, all of these stories into any archetypes. But with that, let's open up we have minutes for any questions from the audience. We're really looking forward to engage you and hear from you if you have anything you'd like to share with us or have us respond to.
We have a mic for you.
We have a mic.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. This is a stale question, but I think it still lingers. This is a racist country, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, so it's not extraordinary that people hate the Muslims. But given 9/11, shouldn't there have been greater outcry from American Muslims against the doctrinaire terrorism that 9/11 represented?
Do you want to take it?
So if you didn't hear her question, she asked why wasn't there, or there is the question of why wasn't there greater denunciation of the terrorist attack from Muslim Americans? And I guess the short answer is there was. It just wasn't covered, and it is easy, as we know, for minority groups especially, to get on the news for negative stories that serve their marginalization, that serve their displacement, that serve their estrangement, that serve their oppression. It is not as easy to get on the news with positive stories or counter narratives that challenge that. And so I appreciate your question, and just for people who don't see, she's nodding her head. So she wasn't asking the question, but she was saying that this is the question, and it is a question that is common. I think, we have seen terrorist acts, in fact, in the last 10 years, more terrorist acts by white men, and they have not been framed as such to cause any other white men to feel like they have to disassociate themselves from those acts. And so the burden of minority groups is, especially for Muslims, is that we aren't allowed individuality. We aren't allowed to establish social distance from the actions of another individual. It becomes a collective guilt. And even with that, Muslims have responded to try to challenge that idea that we are somehow implicated or in support of the actions that kill innocent people.
Yeah, and I just really wanted to add quickly, every person I know who works at a Muslim organization, CARE, ISNA, any masjid board, every single person you find on administrative staff there has said they have written so many press releases and done so many interviews condemning terrorism, not just when terrorist acts happen committed by Muslims, but any terrorism, condolences, thoughts and prayers, doing interviews, Muslims raising money when there are attacks on synagogues or other places of worship. There has been a kind of a swell of Muslims, trying exactly to kind of present a counter narrative than what is heard out there. And so it does exist, as Zaheer said, it's just not as circulated. And there are some who don't want to hear that. And that's not going to conform to what they want to think and know about Islam. And so it's not going to get heard. And so for those of us and for those who do that work, I think most people have kind of resolved themselves to that and just continue to do the work they do, building the organizations and the community work they do. Yeah.
Just following up on what you all have said, I'm wondering if there are any explicit actions that are being taken to really suggest that Muslims in the United States are alive and well and are organized in many communities. I don't need to say that our country is huge, and it is filled with small towns as well as cities as large as Brooklyn. But I'm wondering if there have been any amongst Muslim Americans, if there have been any proactive attempts to change textbooks, for example, for high school students. If Muslim Americans are moving into small towns in the United States. I'd just like to add that I'm here from Kansas, which is deep inland, and this has been a revelation to hear this presentation. I'm eager to take it home and to disseminate the fact that I attended such a panel in Brooklyn, but I would like to see it happening in Alabama. I would like to see it happening in North Dakota. So I'd like to know if there is anyone at work in spreading the word.
There are actually numerous different kinds of national and grassroots efforts around the country that give us hopeful signs of that kind of organizing. I can say for our project, the curriculum that we are developing is a K-12 curriculum that will be aligned with the Common Core standards of certainly New York City public schools, but also which is consistent for national standards. And our objective is to make this a web-based curriculum with resources that teachers around the country can use. And so, this will be completed in November, and then we will work on promoting and publicizing it through conferences and contacting different teachers' organizations around the country. So that is our hope with the work that we've been doing. I know Sylvia's book is available as something you can physically take with you back to Kansas. I gotta do that.
I did not pay him.
I have seen, so ISPU has tried to do some projects themselves in other areas and are continuously trying to expand. It's always dependent in nonprofits on money, but something positive that I've seen are local researchers, especially from the South. I don't know if that's because I recently moved to Charlottesville for a postdoc, and who have reached out and said, we want to do this maybe on a smaller scale, but we want to kind of highlight the contributions of our community. We want to do research where we come out with, statistics and stories, and that really shows kind of where we're present and what we're doing. And there were some researchers in Texas, for instance, and actually also in Charlottesville, which has become this hub of political action. I've really seen the Muslim community there become extremely active. I've only been there for a year, but I've heard over the last few years, a lot of groups have come together. And so it's interesting because it's not just it's the Muslim community, it's the Jewish community, it's the African American community, and a lot of the church leaders who are coming together and saying, we actually have to spearhead this as religious leaders in a grassroots manner. And a lot of people don't even know that at the neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville, the front line is religious leaders. It's the clergy who's standing there getting pushed around. And so they have come to play this big part. So I do think that there are initiatives. I don't know about the demographics. There's so little data. I don't know if you found more data, but maybe you found more data. It's historical, but on kind of the demographics of where people live, which is still very concentrated in cities. That's what we found.
I mean, people generally tend to live where they know other people.
Yeah.
Right? So there's, 1.1% of the U.S. population is Muslim, but there are Muslim populations in places like Texas has a huge Muslim population. In Houston and Dallas, one of the largest in the entire country. And while they are concentrated in the city centers, right? There they are, in the middle of the country. And people drive, people go places, people travel, and it's really about that contact. I mean, they have survey after survey where they say, oh, when people have actually met a person of another faith or a different race and had a conversation with them, it shifts their view. There was just a study that said, Mo Salah, the soccer player in Liverpool, has single-handedly, because of his presence on that team, reduced Islamophobia, right, in Liverpool, in the UK. Right? So it really is about that type of contact, and hopefully through this type of curriculum and through the types of images that are produced, and Zayn Malik or
I forgot.
the pop star, things like that. That's how the tide kind of shifts around people's perceptions. There's a question back there.
I'm just going to plug ISPU because I forgot. But they actually now are doing teacher trainings all over the country. So one way is kind of bringing to teachers kind of more knowledge about Islam in America, Muslims in America, and Islam in America, and help them develop more local curriculum. So that's connects.
Well, I'm just going to put this out there. We need to collaborate again.
Hi, thanks to all of you. It's been fascinating. I'm really interested in learning about other religions. I guess you would say I'm a Christian, but mostly I'm spiritual. So I've been learning a lot, for instance, about Judaism over the last 5 or 6 years, because it's kind of an enigma. We're a country that's so oriented to the sort of, well, at least I am, I guess, the Judeo-Christian sense of values and so forth. So I had one quick question and then another question. The quick question is, the BHS, the presentation that you gave and the stuff that you had on your slides, is that available in print, or will it be available like to the general public at some point, other than in like a curriculum?
It will be with the curriculum, because we're still refining the research.
Okay,
and
so
yes,
an average
absolutely.
member of the public who's not a teacher or a student could sort of get...
Absolutely, it'll be a public website.
Oh, okay,
yes.
cool. So I'm not sure how to ask this, but I think, and this is not Islamophobia per se, I'm looking at the more positive sense of Muslims and their identity as Muslims and how they integrate Islam into their lives, whatever that means to every individual. I'm curious, one, if you've talked to people about, if they were to say to someone who doesn't understand them or know much about them, what is it maybe about their religion, whether they are, actually practice, or, there may be some people that really practice and some people who don't, I don't know, but did you ask anyone what they would want to say about that part of themselves to people who don't maybe understand what that means? So for instance, maybe a Christian would say, well, I learned, hope, faith, and love, and the greatest of these is love, and love your neighbor. And a Jewish person might say, well, justice is the big thing if you want to kind of understand what my driving force is. Maybe there isn't one, but I'm just curious, in terms of those gaps you discussed earlier, if there's something that can kind of crack that sort of positive sense of what it means to be a Muslim in America. As another American, I definitely want to know. As a non-Muslim American, I would want to know.
Well, I think the first thing that I would say in response to that is that Islam is an Abrahamic faith, right? So it's very closely related, not just in the overall sort of ethos and teachings and values with Christianity and Judaism, but in the very stories themselves, and the figures that you'll find in the Bible and the Torah are many of the same exact stories that you'll find in the Quran. Right, it's not perceived, and so that's kind of a matter of perception. And so when you start to talk to people and you say, "Oh, the story of Mary is in the Quran," this, Jesus Christ is revered as a prophet in Islam, and the story of Abraham, and Noah and the Ark, and all these things. These are all stories that Muslims grow up hearing as well. And so there is a shared, kind of understanding that is not being recognized first and foremost. So that would be the first thing. In terms of again, this comes to the story of what you are up against. I often kind of think about Muslims as people who need to walk into a party and like everybody's been talking about them, but they need to go in there and figure out how to make friends. Like everybody's talking about you. They're like, oh my gosh, so-and-so's coming, right? And you have to walk in there and be like, no, I'm not really like that, So there's kind of that feeling sometimes. And I think young Muslims in particular, and young Muslim women who wear this headscarf are very cognizant of that. Kind of all the negative perceptions already that the person that they're just meeting for the first time might be encountering. So that's kind of when you encounter someone like that, the first thing is to kind of think like, well, there are these platitudes. Islam means peace. Islam means submission. Islam is the second largest religion in the world. There are 1.8 billion Muslims worldwide. It is the second religion only to Christianity in terms of global population. So, for me personally, I would just say, hey, 1.8 billion Muslims. That's a lot of different kinds of Muslims practicing Islam a lot of different kinds of ways. Just like Christianity is, practiced a lot of different kinds of ways. And to say it is kind of one thing, I would say talk to Muslims. Yeah, I'm not trying to, I think, it is the Quran. There are 5 pillars. There are things that Muslims are prescribed to do: pray, fast during Ramadan, make the pilgrimage to Mecca. But everybody also engages those in their own way. So there are these basic tenets, but every Muslim practices and engages those rituals in a different, highly individualistic way.
Yeah, and I think, we want to avoid essentializing. At the root, as the truth is for all religions, these are just like traditions that have evolved over centuries that provide human beings a way to access an imagination, an experience that transcends their immediate reality, right? And that's it. Like everyone's just trying to be human. And as crazy as that sounds, the person who is fasting and trying to follow all of their, religious guidelines is looking for what they call salvation. The person that is proclaiming, Jesus Christ, their Lord and Savior, is looking for salvation. The person that is observing the rules of the Old Testament is looking for salvation. However that is defined for that person, what is common for all of them is that they're people. And Toni Morrison has this quote from an address she gave, and I'm going to butcher the poetics of it, but she's basically like, there will always be something. Like the job of racism is to keep you busy defending and correcting and explaining. And in the context of racism in America, somebody said you had, like, your intelligence was linked to the shape of your head. So you spent all this time trying to prove that wasn't the case. Somebody said you didn't have a history, so you spent all of your time trying to prove you had a history. Somebody said that you didn't have this, so you spent all of your time. There's always going to be something. And so, our job is to be. And it is the job of everyone to take on that responsibility to be human and to find that humanity in themselves and connect it with, the humanity outside of themselves. I think we have three more? And I think we should just take these 3 questions and then we'll round up to close out.
Hi, all. My name is Widad. I'm a Muslim from Brooklyn. Just have to put that in there.
Yes.
So my question is really kind of connected to the work I do. So I work at a city agency, the Commission on Human Rights, and my focus is on Muslim communities. And one of the first things I was tasked with was developing a training on understanding Muslim experiences and combating anti-Muslim bias. And within that training, we had a lot of challenges in terms of just, because it was meant for a non-Muslim audience. We were supposed to offer it to different city agencies. But one of the things was a couple of slides that we had featuring famous Muslims. And then another part was a lot of pushback from different folks who were seeing the pilot version of saying, take every Muslim practice and compare it to a Jewish or a Christian practice and show us how similar it is. So my question is really how do you navigate those challenges, and has it come up in your work? And also what is, when we do things like that where we showcase famous Muslims or accomplished Muslims, how I personally feel like it's tokenizing us, and it also sets a very high bar of what it means to be accepted. And it also, I think, dehumanizes Muslims that are working class, who might not be a famous celebrity or a sports person. So I guess that's my question, how do we not perpetuate this idea of an extremely successful person being worthy of dignity and respect, whereas someone who works in a bodega not having that same respect?
Okay, then
Thank
you. Yes.
Hi, thanks ever so much for your presentations. It was really fantastic. So I don't want to darken the mood, but I'm from Britain, so I'm kind of the outsider looking in. And I've grown up wondering, how do Muslims live in America, and how do they deal with the prejudices that, it's similar in Britain, but maybe not to the same extent. We're having, our ruling party is going to elect its next leader, and we're likely to have a racist, sexist man as our next prime minister. You wouldn't know anything about having a leader like that. So I was wondering about the histories and the oral histories and the narratives that you've had, and how people respond to the prejudices, and if they do feel like they live in fear, or if it's different in Brooklyn, and so on, and how it differs across the US.
Okay, and then.
And my comment is maybe a little more lighthearted. I grew up in the Middle East, so the sounds of the azan are kind of like comfort food to me. And then later, I lived several years in Chicago, and I fell in love with the blues, and I'd never thought about that connection. So I just wanted to say thank you all for all of your work, and for making this all so accessible, and taking so much of the potential stress out of talking about these topics.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Quick note, Google when you get home, Levy Camp Holler, Muslim call to prayer. There is this field collar called Levy Camp Holler, and the scholar Sylvia Chan-Malik has juxtaposed it over the Muslim call to prayer, and it will blow your mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You'll just hear, you'll say, oh my
yes.
gosh. It'll
Yes.
just, I play it for my students and for audiences, and people, their jaws drop open.
The vibrato,
So,
the sustaining of the notes, all of the kinds of constriction of the throat to elongate sounds and breaths that is part of what is taught in the recitation of classical Arabic is very much...
It's in those field
It's
holler.
in the field holler.
Yeah, so just
Yeah.
anyone want to, Levy Camp Holler, Muslim call to prayer. So.
Okay, first question I'm going to throw to Elisabeth, which is, we can call it the politics of acceptability. The challenge of trying to do this work of demonstrating contributions to counter Islamophobia.
It's two-sided. I think I agree. I think you don't want to just have these kind of exceptional people. I think throughout the history of racism in the United States, and actually this Muslim leader in Germany said to me, a woman, she said there are two ways to dehumanize someone. You can demonize them, or you can deem them exceptional. And it's kind of the flip side of the same coin. And so it's how do you tell people's stories? I think for us, again, in our like limited time and talking to about 100 people, was trying to represent not just people who are, you know, like a superstar basketball player, which we did have, but also bodega owners, or we had a lot of, you know, local business owners where they were these community centers and social service providers, like Zaheer spoke about, and that is just as important, or to me, perhaps more important. But it doesn't really matter. But to kind of like tell some stories, I think in these limited periods where you give trainings and you have to kind of get information across fast, it's extremely difficult. You're caught between wanting to teach people something. But I also would stand back from this, like equate this to Christianity and Judaism. I think that comes up all of the time, and it came up actually in my research in Europe, in the UK, and in Germany as well, where people would say like, oh, there's a dome like in Christianity, is that why you have a dome? Or so I think people relate to experiences through their own experiences. That's not bad, in my opinion. But it's also, you know, being able to understand Islam on its own terms. And I feel like most people are capable of comprehending what it means to pray, or what it means to fast, or what it means to take the pilgrimage, or any of these things, to give alms, which you do in all of these religions. But I think you have a task.
We do these listening parties for our oral histories, and before we start, we do some ground rules for listening. And one of the things that I like to tell people is that listening is not a narcissistic act. So you should not listen to find yourself. You should listen to be able to sit with a story that you may not be finding yourself in, that you may not find resonance with, but that's the real challenge of listening. Can you listen to something that you don't relate to? Because that's how you begin to build the bridge, the empathy gap, right? It's easy to find resonance with familiarity, but can you find connection with the unfamiliar? And so I think push people to sit with a story or an experience that is completely unlike them. That's the work that we have to do. The next question, or the last question, was about the stories of prejudice. And I think, Sylvia, because you covered a historical period at the height of Jim Crow and racism, how did those stories play out in the work that you looked at, the stories of the women you looked at?
I mean, I think both of your questions, the young lady here on the end and yours as well, are both kind of asking how do we counter anti-Muslim racism? You know, how do we, in our daily lives, in our work, in our personal relationships, in our, you know, in every space of our lives, how do we counter it? And I think it's very fitting that we are in the Brooklyn Historical Society, because as a scholar, I would say you do it by looking at the way so much of what is happening has already happened before, and others have experienced this. And within the Muslim community in the US, and this was one of the large connections I was trying to make in my book, that many of the issues Muslim women in the US are encountering now, this prejudice, this violence, this demonization, are all experiences that African American Muslim women, others in the community, right, in the Muslim community, on the one hand, have already experienced and have enormous wisdom and insight to offer, right? And also in the history of this country, you have the story of Japanese internment. You have the story of Chinese exclusion. You have immigrant community after immigrant community that has undergone this type of marginalization and demonization in their communities. And within the Muslim community, there are so many stories and so many voices, and thus so many histories that can be drawn from, right? So as opposed to holding up an exceptional figure, or as opposed to trying to offer a platitude about who we are, who Muslims are, I think Muslims themselves, right, even in reaching outward, would do well to speak to those who have been here and investigate the stories that we know and know them more deeply, right, and with more complexity, and know them so that they can become our own, so we can incorporate them into our practices of how, you know, Muslim communities and other communities seeking justice move forward.
I think that is a perfect note to end on, with a call for us to recover more and more and more history. So thank you so much for joining us. One final plug. Sylvia's book is on sale, and she's here in case you want her to sign it.
You need to stop.
And now you're watching American History TV.